Hi, I'm going to talk about some ideologies of monolingualism, bilingualism, native-speakerism. It feels weird to say that out loud, you know. Um, it feels normal to see that written down. It's a little pretentious even written down. It's weird saying it. But that's what I'm going to talk about. And some things that you might have noticed in popular culture, or you might not have noticed, how these ideologies can just appear in our daily lives. And then some things that when you realize that the ideology isn't really, let's see, based on fact, um, that you will keep an eye out for, maybe. I really started thinking about this more when I was living in Japan. The ideologies of language are a little different there, and ideologies of native speakerism played a pretty obvious and direct um, role in my life as an English teacher. Um, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But um, since I moved back to the U.S., I have noticed these ideologies play out in the public sphere. And one way that they did, in a really obvious way to me, was the discussions about Star Wars after Episode 7 came out, which is, I think, 2015. So, around the time Episode 7 came out, people were talking about Rey's parents and the mystery of who Rey's parents were. And there was a contingent on the internet who apparently believed that because Rey had a British accent, then her parents must also have a British accent, which would narrow down the possible parents to maybe Obi-Wan, or maybe, as it turned out was true, Palpatine, right? Episode 9 didn't really take a position on whether Rey's accent came from Palpatine or not, but I think the audience is left to fill in the blanks and say, "Oh, no, that makes sense because she talks with that accent too." Of course, it's nonsense, right? And then that reminded me of from the Harry Potter movies, also the books. I've read all the books, um, where Harry learns to speak Parselmouth by having a piece of Voldemort's soul implanted in him, which is called a Horcrux. Um, when Harry is tainted with this sort of quasi biological chunk of Voldemort, he learns to speak a new language, and he doesn't realize at first that he even knows it, right? But he understands the language of snakes, which is called Parcel Tongue, and he can he knows this language, which means that at some point he learned a new grammar. He learned a lot of words. He learned a lot of chunks. He learned correct register and strategic competence in this language of talking to snakes. I don't know what strategic competence means when you're talking to snakes, but he learned all that at some point. And the point was when he was implanted with a piece of Voldemort's soul, which doesn't resemble any pathway to language acquisition that we've heard of, in ELT. Of course, both of these examples contrast with reality. We know that people learn languages by being exposed to them and by growing up in communities, or by, let's say, spending time in communities where they're spoken. When someone says their first language is X, it usually means that's the language that their parents spoke to them. But people's native accent is usually the accent of the community that they grew up in, not their parents. If an Irish child grows up in Texas, they end up with a Texan accent, right? And here I mean Irish just as in of Irish parentage. Say if both of their parents speak with Dublin accents and they grow up in Fort Worth, they'll speak like people in Fort Worth, not like people from Dublin. I was lucky to grow up in a place, Southern California, where this is pretty obvious. People have all kinds of different last names, and their parents speak all different languages. Um, and everyone in my generation that was at my school spoke with pretty much the same accent, with the same level of competence in English. They had various levels of competence in their parents' first languages. Um, Sometimes they would speak not at all and not understand at all. Some people, like my My father speaks pretty much not at all his mother's first language, but he could understand her when she spoke to him in her first language, but not anyone else when they spoke the same language. Some of them ended up going to like Saturday school in that language, and they ended up with it as a pretty competent second language. Um, but that wasn't at all universal, and it didn't depend on the level of their parents' abilities in that language, obviously. So this is very obviously true for people in Orange County, California, whose last names could be Nguyen or Chong or Kim or Martinez, and they all just speak English when they go to school together. If your last name is Smith or Bullock or Johnson too, though, this should be this. You are not an exception to this idea that you speak differently from your parents, or your language competence doesn't depend on your parents' language competence, because um, if you think maybe you got your language from your parents and they got it from their grandparents, then you should speak like your grandparents. And obviously you don't. And you speak even less like your great 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 grandparents or whoever were your ancestors from 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago, at which point we probably can't even call them English speakers anymore, at least not not according to the standards of modern English. They would be considered speakers of a very 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 small and quaint dialect of English nowadays. Right? So your first language and your accent don't depend on your parents, or not as much as popular culture seems to believe. So there's an essentializing ideology that I think helps explain why people might assume that this is true, that your parentage or your race, to take a slightly larger grouping, determines your language and your culture. People tend to lump these three together, right? Um, if you speak a language, of course, your access to a culture is better than someone who doesn't speak that language. And to some extent, speaking a language requires learning at least some of the the small c cultural ideas, or I guess habits of mind, you could say, of a particular culture, um, and the connections between them. And for that reason, you can say culture and language intersect more than coincidentally, right? But language and culture don't intersect race at all, or they shouldn't. If they do, it's purely a coincidence, right? It's purely correlation, and there's no causation at all in that association. But people tend to lump these three together again. Um, I'm hoping that a Venn diagram will appear on the screen at this point. People tend to put race, culture, language all together and assume that one causes the other, or the correlation is so strong that they might as well cause one another. And in the very center of these overlapping circles, the center of the Venn diagram, you might have the essentialized pure native speaker, someone who checks all the boxes, or ticks all the boxes, so to speak. Right? They're the correct race. They're the race that you assume would have that culture and that language. Of course, they grew up in that culture and they speak whatever is taken to be the standard variety of that language, right? Um, so going back to my work history, when I was working in Japan, being a native speaker was a big selling point. Probably for my school, and I found out by doing some research late into the life of my school that actually that was the main reason my students were coming to me, not my experience or pedagogy or delightful personality. Um, People often hire native speakers based on quasi-racial characteristics, and what they mean by native speaker is a perfect representative of the culture of native speakers, which is sort of left to imagination, but is, sort of assumed to be um, North American or British. And people think that you can judge this mostly based on appearance. So you might see in an advertisement for native speakers that they have to have a certain hair color or a certain eye color. Um, it's not common to see that in advertising nowadays, but it has happened before, And the fact that it has occurred at all is telling. And again, if someone is judged to be a native speaker, they're assumed to have perfect cultural knowledge to represent the cultures of Britain and North America, to a lesser degree, I guess, Australia. And they're assumed to have perfect language ability, perfect native speaking English ability. And if you're not one of these, right, if you don't fit into one of these circles, you're assumed not to be deficient in the other areas as well, right? So if you could be, like a Japanese American and might not speak Japanese, as I didn't when I moved to Japan, might not really know anything about Japanese culture, but you'll be assumed at least not to be a native speaker of English, right? Even if you grew up in Michigan and, I don't know, everything else about you is exactly the same as your neighbors on either side of you back in Michigan, right? On the other hand, if you are Caucasian and not a native speaker of English, and not culturally American, you might just be lumped in with them anyway and get the benefits of this essentializing ideology. You could be Swedish, you could be French, you might just still be considered a native speaker of English based on other characteristics, right? And sort of taking apart the native speaker concept in this way is not to argue that there is no such thing as a native speaker, but just to comment on, in the popular imagination, that term native speaker sort of having other characteristics sort of glommed onto it, right? So I hope, being a little bit circumspect about the idea of native speakers and the idea that your race, your culture, and your language are all intimately connected, will give you a little bit of a red flag that pops up in your head whenever you hear certain words in the future, certain words or certain terms or certain ideas. One of those might be the term heritage speakers. People are often assumed to be a heritage speaker based on last name rather than being a speaker of a language. In California, where I grew up, it wasn't unusual for someone named Kim to be considered a heritage speaker of Korean, whether or not they spoke Korean. And indeed, people have been in California long enough that you could have like 4 generations of non-Korean speakers and just still have their last name, and that would make you a heritage speaker of Korean. The reason this could be a problem is if that person decides that they do want to learn Korean, or Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese, they might be determined to be a heritage speaker of that language, whether or not that is appropriate. And especially if their name is Kim and they're trying to learn Chinese, then they shouldn't be, right? But it can lead to a view of their language abilities, which is really unfair, which is that they should be perfect because they're a heritage speaker, because it sort of is assumed to somehow run in their family or run in their blood. So if they're a learner just like everyone else, they'll be judged to be curiously deficient, right, rather than a learner. The film Selena, I think, which is one of Jennifer Lopez's first big acting roles, actually put this really well in a scene that Selena in the movie, and I guess in real life, didn't speak Spanish, but she was determined to be deficient, and she was able to play that to her advantage because she was, a magnetic personality. But I think it was the father character said Mexican Americans have to be perfect Mexicans and perfect Americans, and if they're not, it's not that people will give them a break because they're just learning Spanish. They'll be judged to be, strangely deficient. In my experience of learning Japanese, I really, really didn't like the point where a Japanese native speaker would find out that I have some family in Japan, because it would take whatever progress I made in the language from being, +1 or +2 down to -10, because after they learned that I should, I'm a heritage speaker, their view of my language abilities changed from, oh, he's pretty good for a foreigner, to, oh, he's Japanese, but somehow he's just not very good at Japanese, right? I think that happens to quite a few people. One group of people it doesn't seem to happen to is Caucasians in the United States. Whatever language you want to learn as a Caucasian, it always seems to be taken as a delightful accoutrement, right? Not somehow trying to reclaim something that was lost, or you won't be expected to speak German if your last name is Richter, or you won't be expected to speak French if your last name is, I don't know, insert last name here, right? And this probably is true for the dominant ethnic group in a lot of different countries. Another term besides heritage speaker that might set off a red flag. That's an interesting metaphor. Is bicultural, and just because people often use bicultural as what they might think of as a euphemism for biracial, um, maybe because they feel like race is a social construct and we shouldn't just refer to people like it unquestioningly. That's all true, but culture is also a social construct, and you're not helping the forward progress of, I don't know, wokeness, I guess, by continuing to use culture as a stand in for race, right? That's the opposite of what you should be doing. Another term is bilingual. Uh, More the adjective that comes before bilingual. So people often use words like he's a true bilingual to refer to someone who probably started learning both languages as a child, or full bilingual. Um, I heard this view evinced on an episode of Chelsea, which was a Chelsea Handler's talk show on Netflix a couple years ago. I think it only lasted about a year. Someone was saying that you can only be a true bilingual if you have a parent who speaks both languages. A parent who speaks either language. Um, and that, in their mind, was the only way to guarantee, true or full bilingualism in children. But of course, people learn languages over the course of their lives, right? The different life stages that they spend in different cultural environments determine what their strengths are. Um, Someone who is born in California and speaks maybe, say, Vietnamese with their parents, but goes to school in English and graduates, including high school and college, all of their levels of education in English is not going to be equally strong in both of those languages, even if they speak Vietnamese with their parents. So calling someone a full or true bilingual sort of essentializes bilingualism into people who are equally true, equally strong in both languages, which don't exist, and then people who are not. And actually, almost everyone in the world is really in this category among multilinguals. I don't know anybody who is equally strong in both languages. Um, and I mean, that's just true when you realize that people learn languages during their lives, not at the moment of their birth, right? Um, the last two, authentic. The way I hear this word often in popular culture, usually it refers to restaurants, and it means the people who are in the kitchen appear to belong to the race that you think they should. And again, race is supposed to somehow lead to culture, which is supposed to lead to truly, I don't know, cooking that best represents the culture that they come from. Um, my main complaint is you just can't judge authenticity by the color of the people cooking. Um, Often, I used to work at a Japanese restaurant. People would say it was authentic because we had Asian chefs, and our Asian chefs were from Vietnam, and some were from Japan, some were from El Salvador. Um, and so authenticity is often really based on characteristics that we shouldn't be considering as importantly as we do. And then also, it's very clearly in the eye of the beholder. Whatever prejudices someone has when they're judging something to be authentic is reflected in their definition of authenticity. As long as someone looks Asian, they're authentic Japanese chefs, right? To some people. And the last word is self-hating. Self-hating to me is a clear, what's the word I'm looking for? Conflation of race with culture. So the assumption is if your last name is, say, Tanaka, right? But you grew up in the Midwest in the United States and you don't particularly care for sushi, and Remembering what we said about the word authenticity, the definition of not liking sushi in the Midwest might be you don't eat California rolls. But anyway, people will assume based on your last name and based on your heritage that you should like sushi. And if you don't, you're self hating because people assume that yourself, your identity, comes from your race or your ethnic background, and that culture comes along with that. If you don't like the culture or what people think is the culture, you must hate yourself. And obviously, that represents a very unhealthy glomming on of race to culture. Well, I guess that came across as a list of words that I don't like, but I don't know. I hope it's something for you to think about.